If you keep up with any of the trends happening in the podcasting industry, then you already know that Spotify is making its name known. So is YouTube for that matter. But Spotify is really disrupting how we think about podcasting, which is why when I met Spotify ad executive and podcaster Corey Kareem last year at Podcast Movement, I knew you needed to meet him too. And he's here with me today in the studio to share the behind the scenes insights for the tools that Spotify's working on, as well as some of the tools that just dropped that's going to change the game for podcasters. And more importantly, that's going to bring more opportunity to the industry and how you can use these tools to get discovered by new listeners who need to hear your message. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Corey, what's up? Thank you so much for making the time to be here today.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney, for having me. Truly blessed to be here.
Well, it was so awesome getting to meet you a few months ago at Podcast Movement and really sitting down and having a behind the scenes conversation about the unique role that you are in, both on the platform side and ad sales at Spotify and also on the creator side as a podcast host. So I'm super excited for this conversation to just kind of lift the curtain a bit and talk about some of these new tools that Spotify has rolled out to help us understand our audiences better. And I know over here in podcasting land, like we're all so excited about this because it's been kind of a gray area and kind of dark to know like, well, where are our listeners coming from? Where are they finding us? If they find us, do they actually click through? And so Spotify is really making strides to make this kind of information more visible. So I'm curious, given your experience on the platform side and definitely on the creator side, first of all, what are these tools? And secondly, what steps should we be taking as podcasters to really make the most of them?
Yeah, so I think step number one, if for your listeners, if you guys are not signed up for Spotify for podcasters, which is now being changed actually to Spotify for creators, recently that change was made, I would say step number one is to sign up for that platform. Once you've signed out to that platform, play around with it. Just like any new tool that's out there, you want to familiarize yourself with it, get acquainted with it, because there's a lot of things that you might not know or understand. Now, there's a new feature, Courtney, that I really love that actually just came out maybe like 4 weeks ago. They just came out with a bunch of new features, and the one that really sticks out to me is the feature where you can upload clips of your podcast. So this is very similar to like Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts. And I love this as an opportunity. This is also Spotify's push to become more of a holistic platform. Obviously, we're known as being the audio player, the player or platform for digital audio. So we're trying to expand that narrative to be also considered for video as well. So this is a great chance for any podcaster, really new or seasoned, and they want to improve their discoverability, because now you give yourself, if you add that short 60-second clip to your new episode that you just published, you now give the opportunity for people to discover you elsewhere. So when people, for example, so if they're on Spotify, they click on the podcast tab, there's a discovery feed. And now your video clip can be a part of that discovery feed, therefore giving you another opportunity for your content to be discovered by users.
I saw that. I thought that was so interesting. Spotify, I feel like, is really changing the game when it comes to how creators create and really kind of bringing some of the different elements of the different platforms that we're used to, your social media platforms, your long form content platforms, under one roof. And so the short form clips I am especially fascinated by, because it's interesting, Corey, that wasn't the first thing that jumped out at me with the new features that Spotify was rolling out. Because for me, short form video, I'm like, I don't want to touch short form video with a 10-foot pole. And yet, if it's going to play a role in the discovery of my podcast, well, I might be paying a little closer attention. So I'm curious then, okay, let's talk about the short form video piece. How is that going to operate? Is that going to function similarly to, let's say, like Instagram Explore page, where it's going to show you content that it thinks you are interested in, and that's how you might discover a new podcast based on your listening habits or preferences? Or is this something that's just giving creators a bigger opportunity to get their podcasts more visible?
I think it's both. I think they work together quite nicely. So the reason why Spotify has become what it's become, this is my POV, and yes, I do obviously have some experience from working there, is that we specialize in what we call recommendation media. You have social media, you have recommendation media. Now, one could say that a lot of social media in general has become recommendation media, but this is what Spotify truly specializes in. So to your point, it is going to recommend podcasts that it's believes that you're going to be interested in. So now that you've added this video clip of your podcast, you're now part of this video feed once you click onto the podcast tab. So now there's another way for people to discover you. So yes, to your both of your points there, new opportunity to take your podcast from being one dimensional to now multi-dimensional.
What I will say that I like about it, though, Corey, as we sit here and just kind of think about this, and I'm nutting this through in my brain as we speak, is the idea that one of the things that we know to be true with social media is that short form content on social media platforms does not necessarily translate to podcast listeners. Because while some of those users might listen to podcasts, the vast majority of them are there for entertainment. They're not there to find new podcasts. Whereas on Spotify, it's already an audio medium. So people are already there to listen to audio or music or podcasts, right? Whatever form of audio they might be looking for or listening to. So I can see that working really well as a discoverability mechanism for podcasters specifically.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, so there's a discovery tool on Spotify that's going to show you where you're getting your traffic from exactly. And so I would argue that a majority of podcasters are getting a lot of their traffic organically, meaning that there's people looking them up or they've been recommended that. So it's coming native to the platform. That's a better way of articulating it. And so if that is true, then using video clips or the short form videos that's going to be playing natively within the platform will only go towards your benefit. Because to your point, you're right. If I am making a short form clip for Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, the likelihood of that person clicking on that link or going over is on the lesser side of things. That's kind of more of an awareness play. But once you're in a platform that's native to podcast listening, it's only going to help you out.
Yeah. Which interestingly enough, Apple has had video. You can upload a video to Apple. This has been around for years now, but nobody knows about it because nobody uses it. And so this is why it's like blowing our mind. Oh my gosh, Spotify added video, but it's actually been around, but it's not been utilized well and not utilized in this way. I'm curious, is there any kind of targeting that we'll be able to do with these videos? Or is this just really going to just go out kind of like it does on Instagram and it's shown to everyone? Is there an engagement feature that, like Instagram, the more people engage with it, the more it's going to get shown? Or how does that work? Can you give us a little bit of insight there?
Yeah, you know what? I don't have too much details there, but I suspect that could be the long tail evolution of the product. Right now, as it stands, it's probably just an awareness tool that gives podcasters another way to kind of build their audience and kind of scale that out. And going back to your Apple point, there's a reason why people don't know that Apple has that feature. And that's quite simply, Apple doesn't really promote their podcast tools and features like Spotify does. In fact, I kind of have like a weird, quirky analogy, Courtney. And I say music and podcast is to Apple what gas is to Costco. It's a value add. It's not their priority, quite frankly. And so that's the reason why people don't really know about those tools for Apple per se.
Yeah, great point. I love the way you put that. It makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. Also, speaking of that discovery tab, so I was actually looking at mine right before we hopped on and hit record because I was curious now, okay, because you can see, okay, how many people have you reached? How many people have actually showed interest? And then from those that showed interest, how many people have actually hit play and streamed your podcast? And so we can actually see a click-through rate, a conversion rate, which I think is just so wonderful because we never had this information before. So I'm curious from the creator side, how can these analytics specifically help us better understand our listeners and make more strategic decisions for our content beyond just like, okay, I've got, X amount of listeners on my podcast or I've got X amount of downloads on my podcast, to actually be able to see the progression of the listener journey. And if listeners are progressing through, how can we use that then to inform the content we're creating?
Yeah, really great question. I would say, so for example, let's just take that part where you said that a majority of your listeners are coming through the referral link. So you copying and paste the referral link for your episode on their podcast. If you see that you're having a lot of success there, then I would be doubling down on, let's say, your social media efforts. So if you're posting on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, et cetera, I'd really be doubling down on those efforts since they seem to be working well for you. Now, if that wasn't the story and you are getting a lot of organic traffic, which happens to be more so my case, and I think a lot of others as well, I might then consider, hey, in terms of content creation and strategy, in terms of building my audience, maybe I should consider running Spotify ads since I'm getting a lot of native traction towards my podcast. That's an alternative. Either way, the way I look at information is it's an opportunity to learn. So if my referral links are not as high as I'd like them to be, perhaps it's worth investigating to see why that is. Is my titling wrong? Am I not using more engaging clips? So on and so forth. But I think also what's fascinating, if we're going to dig down into the different tools that are available for you from a data standpoint, I think when you look at your audience, this is something that's very interesting. I'm going to geek out here for a second. So if you're looking at your audience, right, and I'll use myself as an example. I have about like 48% female, 48% male, I think 2% other, right? And I think when it comes to the actual age, I'm about close to 50% of my audience is between 35 to 44. So let's call that millennials with a little bit of Gen X. And then about 60% of my audience comes from the US. Another 30% comes from Canada. 10% is like other, let's just say other countries. If I know that's to my audience mix, my audience profile, let's just call it that, I can then get a little bit cheeky and I can go into ChatGPT and I say, okay, based on this audience profile, all those things I just listed out, what are the top 3 to 5 topics that would resonate with this audience based on their location? Chat would spit out 3 to 5 things. I can then use that to craft my content. So this is another way you can add to your strategy. Now, for me, I have an interview show similar to yourself. I can then find out experts based on the topics that chat recommended and kind of reverse engineer it and kind of build my next content schedule based off of those answers.
That's really smart. Also, because there might be trending topics
Mm-hmm.
that for me in a specific niche with a specific topic focus wouldn't be thinking about, but that might even give me a way to brainstorm and say, oh, how can I tie that in? Because we know that if we can talk about things that are more trending that people are naturally going to be looking for, then that can also help you get discovered as well. Really smart. You know what's interesting, Corey, too, is speaking about analytics. Okay, I'm literally looking in it's Spotify for creators now. I was going to say my Spotify for podcasters dashboard. So I'm looking there now and it says where people find your content. And then it gives me a few options. So it says Spotify Home, Spotify Search, Spotify Library. Most of my traffic comes from Spotify Search, which for me is a win because we do a lot with SEO with the podcast. But can you break down the differences in that for someone who is familiar with the Spotify app maybe, but then is looking at these analytics and is like, okay, where does that mean someone's clicking? The home versus the search versus the library?
Yeah. So as I've come to understand it, Spotify Home is like when you're on the home page and then you have the podcasts that are recommended to you. The search is when someone actually goes into search and types in Diary of a CEO or JRE, Joe Rogan, Call Her Daddy, et cetera, et cetera. Referral links, that's pretty straightforward. That's the link that you can copy and paste. And then the library is once you click into podcast, there's a library there. So it's a library of podcasts that are recommended to you based on your past listening habits. So those are the 4 different ways that we've categorized that people can discover you to listen to your podcast.
Really interesting. I love that. Thanks for that breakdown. That helps me to think about, okay, and how we're approaching, based on where we're showing up, what we're doubling down on behind the scenes, to your point. So let me ask you this. Okay, is there any difference in the analytics that new creators should be looking at versus established creators? Is it the same insights that they should be looking at? Or are there insights that are important relative to where they are, let's say, in their podcasting journey?
This is a good one. So if I'm a new creator, I am definitely looking at my audience breakdown, so my demographics. And kind of what I said earlier, looking at my personal audience breakdown. So again, I think I said 48% male, female. So it's split quite evenly between male and female, US, Canada for the most part, and then primarily millennials. If I'm seeing that in my dashboard, I'm then figuring out, again, what topics resonate with this core audience. And I'm going to double down on what's really interesting for this core audience group using the same methodology that I just described earlier. That's what I would be doing because I think one of the biggest challenges new podcasters have is building out an audience, right? And having a loyal audience. And I don't necessarily, notice I didn't use the word having a massive audience. I think that's a little bit of a misconception in our industry that you need a massive audience to be successful. Obviously, that's helpful, but you could be a micro content creator and still be very successful as well. Have a following of 10,000 people, let's just say. So for me, it's about having an audience that's highly engaged. Let's just phrase it that way. Okay. So again, if I am a new creator, I am focusing on building out my audience to make sure that they're an engaged audience. I'm giving them what they want. Now, if I'm more seasoned and established, so I have a highly engaged audience, the only thing really different that I'm doing personally, and there's a lot of things that you could do, but what I would do is now I'm packaging that information and I'm putting that in the form of an EPK. And what I'm doing is I'm going to go back to chat, and I do not work for ChatGPT. There's not a plug. It's just a tool that I honestly just use quite frequently. I'm going into chat and say, hey, based on my analytics, my demo, all that stuff, what are brands that align most with my core demographic? And I'm getting a laundry list of brands that I could potentially go after to get sponsorship ads, do integrations, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more so a progression of the data, how I'm looking at it, but essentially you're doing the same thing. But I will say though, even though I just mentioned all of that, I think regardless of where you are in your podcast journey, and I know most of your listeners are business owners, if I'm an independent creator, I should be thinking of a product or a service that I could come up with automatically from the get-go. Regardless if I'm a seasoned person or a new person, I'm actually thinking, if I can go back in time, I would probably start that way. Is there a product or a service that I can offer? And then I kind of build my podcast around that.
Oh, love that. Also, you mentioned EPK. Could you break down what that is just for those that might not know?
Yeah, sure. Sometimes the lingo and the jargon can, I just assume everyone knows, but no, electronic press kit. So again, it's kind of like a pitch deck for yourself or your show, right? 3, maybe 7 slides about what your show is, who your audience is, what makes you special or different from other podcasters and things of that nature.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. No, it's like me when I was learning Facebook ads, like CPL, EPL, CTR. What are we looking at? What all does all this stuff mean? So and eventually it just becomes second nature. Yeah. So, okay, let me ask you this. So given your background working with Spotify and as a creator yourself, how do you see Spotify evolving over the next few years to support creators to reach new audiences? And if and how Apple might try to compete?
Ooh, well, Apple will always try to compete to a certain extent. But I think the next level is doubling down on monetization opportunities for creators. The reason why I say that, so right now, for your listeners that don't know, there is an opportunity that exists right now. So if you actually host your podcast on Spotify and you meet their criteria, and I think the criteria is 10,000 hours streamed in 30 days, 2,000 unique listeners, and at least 12 episodes published. I think that's it. Don't quote me 100% on that. If you meet that qualification, you could become a part of their Spotify program, right? Where you could be a part of their ads program through DAI, dynamic ad insertion. Well, they'll just dynamically insert ads into your podcast, right? So there's that option that exists right now for creators to make money. Now, I think the next evolution, again, no one in the company has told me this. This is purely Corey Kareem's prediction. I think the next evolution is giving more opportunities to make money. That could come in the form of, hey, Courtney's selling sweaters, t-shirts, hats, mugs. And the reason why I say that, Courtney, is that infrastructure technically already exists on Spotify for artists, though, right? Ticket sales. So let's just say you're going to have a live event. Users can now click on a link to go register for your next live event. Or if they want to just simply donate to your podcast. Right now, Spotify has that for artists. Donate to the artists you really love via PayPal. So I think that because that infrastructure technically already exists, I could see potentially that coming over to creators as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Oh, I'd be curious to see if that happens. It'd be nice to have all that under one roof. I love this vision that Spotify has cast. It's going to be interesting to see what unfolds here over the next few years. Thank you for being here to just share with us, really how we can best be utilizing the Spotify platform and to understand it early so that we don't miss the boat, because Spotify is definitely going places. So, Corey, thanks for being here today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
And if you found this episode helpful, I would love it if you would take 30 seconds and tap the 5 stars on Apple or on Spotify, and bonus points if you're listening on Apple when you leave a review. Let me know. Let me know how this show is helping you. Let me know if you're getting value from it. Because when you let me know, you're also letting other listeners know that this show is worth their time. And then stick around, because if you loved this episode, you're going to really love the next one. Corey is joining us back to share his personal journey from the other side of the mic as a creator, to show you why failure in podcasting, failure is actually your greatest weapon for podcast growth. I know, seems counterintuitive, but we're going to break it all down, and I'm going to show you how to take your failures as a podcast host and your missteps and your mistakes that we all make, that happen to literally all of us, and use them as the foundation for your podcast growth and for a show that your audience cannot ignore. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.